Fanny's rides recommenced the very next day, and as it was a pleasant, fresh-feeling morning, less hot than the weather had lately been, Edmund trusted that her losses, both of health and pleasure, would... I'm Harriet.
And I'm Ellen, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week, we're looking at chapters 8 to 11 of Mansfield Park. Do you want to start with your 100-word summary?
Yes, here we go. The Crawfords, the young Bertrams, Mrs. Norris and Fanny visit Sotherton to discuss improvements. The women driven by Mr. Crawford in his barouche, with Julia occupying the box seat. After a tour of the house, they break into trios, which are soon reduced to pairs. Julia is forced to remain with Mrs. Rushworth. Maria and Henry escape from Mr. Rushworth around the gate across the ha-ha, after Fanny, abandoned in the artificial wilderness by Edmund and Mary Crawford, overhears his suggestive remarks about her engagement, and Mary is appalled to discover that Edmund intends to take orders.
Okay. The young people and Mrs. Norris visit Sotherton. Julia travels on the barouche box with Henry, which makes Maria jealous. Edmund, Mary and Fanny walk in the wilderness, but when Fanny has to rest, Edmund and Mary go off together. Henry, Maria and Rushworth arrive. Rushworth returns to the house for a key to the park gate, and Henry convinces Maria to squeeze past the gate, and they walk off together. Julia arrives and also gets past the gate. Rushworth returns and goes after them. Sir Thomas is due home in November, which stresses Maria. Mary isn't happy to have learned that Edmund plans to become a clergyman. It was interesting trying to combine it because most of these chapters are about the visit to Sotherton, except for the one chapter at the end, which was kind of hard to integrate.
Yes.
So what did you want to start with?
What I started with this section is niggling away at this thing that bothers me, which is the way Jane Austen is trying to make us like Fanny and disapprove of Mary Crawford, and yet continually counteracting that by making Mary Crawford appear as lovely. But, I was just taken with the way, she's trying to tell you that Fanny is so intelligent and so receptive, and she was able to make it so clear with Marianne in Sense and Sensibility. And it's pretty hard to really believe it of Fanny. So she's saying Fanny was very happy in observing all that was new and admiring all that was pretty. She was not often invited to join in the conversation of the others, nor did she desire it. Her own thoughts and reflections were habitually her best companions, and in observing the appearance of the country, these are the things Jane Austen thinks it was really good to do. The appearance of the country, the bearings of the roads, the difference of soil and the state of the harvest, the cottages, the cattle, the children, she found entertainment that could only have been heightened by having Edmund to speak to of what she felt. And, actually it's not really a sensibility she's got there so much as a sort of a really good grasp of farming.
Although I had actually highlighted, I think, a sentence or so after that, where it talks about how Mary Crawford is very unlike her and says she had none of Fanny's delicacy of taste, of mind, of feeling. She saw nature, inanimate nature, with little observation. Her attention was all for men and women, her talents for the light and lively.
Yes,
so it's definitely setting up a Fanny good, Mary bad.
Yeah.
But nothing in that sentence really tells you why it is bad to like people more than nature, particularly since Jane Austen herself from her letters seemed to be very much engaged with having attention for all
in
for
her
men and
letters she's very keen on whether it's muddy or not. That's what she that's what she always notices in the letters. Yeah.
Although I have been thinking what you were saying last time about, in spite of all this work Jane Austen is doing to tell us Fanny is so wonderful, why readers don't like her, I think the one thing you missed out is the complaint that Fanny is too good and too pious. I think that's basically just an issue of, I don't think she is too good. I think she tries to be good, and Jane Austen approves of that. But I don't think Jane Austen is presenting her as a saint. Even in all of this stuff where she's saying how wonderful Fanny is, I don't think she's setting up Fanny as a picture of never had an ill thought or or a bad action?
Oh, no, well, I mean, I think going back to my older picture of Fanny, the thing that I thought was wonderful about the picture of Fanny is you have somebody who wants to be good, who knows she's having all these wrong things, and who is fighting against it. And that's why I've sort of always admired Fanny as a picture of somebody who knows her nature is not pushing her to be always good, but she knows what she should be doing and is struggling when it isn't easy for her.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just that phrase that I've always held on to, turns up somewhere in the Lionel Trilling article, where he talks about Elizabeth Bennet having a grace of ease, but Fanny having a grace of difficulty. This has been my basic feeling of Fanny, and now I'm sort of testing it as we go through.
Yeah.
You get this example of Mary's flirtation, which is to pretend to be stupid and to say sort of ignorant things and stick with it and keep Edmund guessing, and he enjoys it and she enjoys it.
I actually find it a little bit irritating.
But it works with Edmund.
Yeah.
It doesn't work with Fanny. It's dead boring for Fanny.
Yeah.
But
it's not as profoundly irritating to me as Marianne Dashwood often is. I just find it a little bit annoying, but then I'm not Edmund.
yes.
And it's Edmund she's putting on the show for.
Yeah, I suppose the other thing that comes through in this is Fanny's expectations of Edmund. That she honestly thinks Edmund has this commitment to her. She thinks it's right that she should trail around with Edmund and Mary Crawford. And when they escape from her, she's really upset that they don't come back quickly for her.
It can be irritating when someone says, I'll only be 5 minutes, and then they're an hour.
Yes.
The other thing I think that really hurts Fanny is they spent that hour in the avenue. She wanted to see the avenue. They couldn't see it when they were coming up to the house because they were coming up on the east side and the avenue was on the west side.
Yes.
You couldn't see it from the pleasure ground or from within the wilderness. And yet Edmund and Mary walked off to assess the size of the wilderness, found a gate, went through and sat down under a tree under the avenue. And I don't blame Fanny for being a bit upset in that case that Edmund didn't think this is what she wanted to see, why don't we go back and get her? I can see why Edmund didn't do that, but I can also see why she would be a bit hurt.
The thing that I find interesting is her expectation that Edmund should be concerned for her welfare, even though she sees herself as the lowest of the low and everyone else can ignore her. She really believes Edmund has this commitment to her. And you wonder, what is Edmund's attitude to her? Is he treating her, I suppose, like a younger brother or sister?
I think he is. It's also probably over the years become a habit. He's almost appointed himself Fanny's protector because no one else, especially Mrs. Norris, will.
Yes.
Maybe if Fanny had asserted more independence herself by now, which she's old enough that she probably could have, he wouldn't feel under such an obligation. But I think it is something he has taken on himself, and I don't think he in any way resents it.
It's only starting to be a bit of a burden now when she's always there with Mary.
Yeah.
There were these couple of little points that I thought we could talk about.
Yep.
One of them is the barouche, because I suddenly discovered that on the internet they're telling you, no, you mustn't say barouche, you have to say baroo.
Okay.
So I went and looked it up in my Jones Pronouncing Dictionary, which is this book that I rely on, which tells you the way educated people in England pronounced words in about 1910.
Yep.
And he definitely gives barouche as the first one with the sh sound, but he does also, as an alternative, give baroo.
Okay. I can tell you that in the 1983 BBC miniseries, they definitely talk about the barouche. And I can also remember in the 1995 Emma Thompson film of Sense and Sensibility, they say barouche. So whatever they said in Jane Austen's day, the modern interpretation of that word does seem to be barouche.
Yes. But then the other thing that made me want to talk about it a little bit more is on one of the lists I belong to, there was suddenly a discussion of what a barouche was like, and they came up with all sorts of alternatives. How many horses did it have? How many people would it hold? So I just sort of thought, well, we know what this barouche is like.
Yes.
It's the barouche where you have a separate box where two people can sit, the driver and a passenger, and it's sort of attached to this nicely hung open carriage where you have four people who sit opposite one another, and that's the barouche that's here.
Yes.
I don't care what other barouches had.
Well, maybe there were different types of barouche, but yes, it's very specific here.
And then the other thing I'd like to have a little discussion of, because I've come across it discussed on an email list, is where Edmund says, "At Oxford, I have been a good deal used to have a man lean on me for the length of a street, and you are only a fly in the comparison." And the people who were discussing this tended to imply he had a drunken friend, and that's what he was used to.
I'd never noticed that line before rereading it this time. And on this reading, that was actually also what I thought. Not specifically a drunken friend, but just the fact that when he was at Oxford, he tended to be the designated driver. Yeah, he maybe didn't drink as much as his friends, so he was often the one helping them get back to their rooms.
Well, my original view of it was simply that he was taking some tutor along there. He was taking some middle-aged Don who was leaning on his arm. I don't know why, I suppose because he was leaning.
What it says in the notes to my Cambridge edition, it talks about the custom of undergraduates walking arm in arm at Oxford continued into the 20th century.
And arm in arm was a big deal. It was the way they showed friendship, but it also had quite a lot of status involved. That if you felt you were inferior, you couldn't link your arm. You had to wait for the superior person to link with you, and then off you went together. Though whether that was operating when Edmund was there, I don't know. But definitely that was the case in the 1920s.
Oh, one thing that struck me is that when Fanny first came to Mansfield, she had this immensely long journey from Portsmouth to Mansfield, and yet since she's been at Mansfield, she's never travelled more than a couple of miles from the house, because it says that their road was through a pleasant country, and Fanny, whose rides had never been extensive, was soon beyond her knowledge. So it's like after this immense journey when she was 10, she's been contained in this very, very small geographical area.
Yes.
I think probably the most significant bit in these chapters is in the wilderness, and then Fanny sitting on the bench while other people come and go around her.
Yes, and this is the first time she hears Henry Crawford's flirtation technique. We've heard Mary Crawford's, which is this pretending to be a bit silly. With him, it's making all these suggestive remarks about Mr. Rushworth. And they ignore Fanny. They don't think she matters. They can go on saying this. So right at from the very beginning, almost, Fanny is aware of the slyness,
Well, we, the reader, got it a little bit earlier at the scene in the chapel where Henry quietly says to Maria, "I do not like to see Miss Bertram so close to the altar." But yes, in this scene, they obviously think Fanny is of no more account than a servant. But this whole scene is often described as being very symbolic. One of our listeners, Amber, has let us know that there's another podcast called The Literary Life that's just done a read-through of Mansfield Park. And they draw a lot of Christian symbolism from it, and particularly talk about Henry taking the role of Satan, tempting Maria across the boundary. And I've certainly also read other people talking about this being a metaphor for licit versus illicit sex, with Mr. Rushworth, the rightful owner of Maria's sexuality, going to get the key, and then Henry tempts her across. Now, we've said before Jane Austen doesn't really do symbolism, and I do stand by that, but I do also think this scene is, if not actually symbolic, it's certainly foreshadowing of what happens later.
Yes.
But the other thing that really strikes me with it is that Henry is doing more than just flirting with Maria.
He's tempting her.
He is actively tempting her. Maybe it's going a bit far to call him Satan, but it's just further down the path.
Perhaps you could call him Mephistopheles then.
Henry knowingly and explicitly is encouraging Maria to basically do things that really are not socially approved of.
Yes.
I think it moves from flirting to seduction.
Yes.
That he's not trying to get her to sleep with him, but he is absolutely trying
to distract, to pull her away from the person she's committed to.
Yeah. And of course the worst thing of all with Henry is that he doesn't actually mean any of it. He is encouraging Maria to do all these dangerous things.
Yes.
And leading her to expect that because she is willing to do that with him, she is willing to break these boundaries. That's another point that the Literary Life podcast made, that whereas today we see bursting through boundaries as a sign of freedom and independence, they can also, and more traditionally were seen more as boundaries to keep you safe, and breaking through those boundaries is a bad thing. And certainly that is the sense in that scene by the gate. The correct thing to do is to wait for Mr. Rushworth to come back with the key and legally and licitly go through the gate.
Yes.
And by not waiting for him, by going through on their own without the key, that is not appropriate behaviour.
Yes.
That is such a meaningful scene. Whether it's symbolic or not, whether it's foreshadowing or not, every line that Henry and Maria have has a double meaning. It has the surface meaning and it has the undercurrent meaning.
Yes.
And that's really not something you get all that often in Jane Austen.
No.
That sort of, it's not quite double entendre, but it's getting close to it.
But possibly that's Henry's style.
Yeah. Now, you were talking last time about Mary, her attitude towards marriage as being the big warning sign. But of course, in this scene, we get another big warning sign, which is her attitude to the church, which I think we have to take as possibly the biggest gulf between her and Edmund. Not just moral, ethical, principle gulf between them, but also the biggest practical gulf.
Yes.
In that if they want to have a life together, someone is going to have to compromise. Either Mary is going to have to compromise on her attitude to the clergy, or Edmund is going to have to compromise and not become a clergyman.
Yes.
In these chapters, you're both seeing the development of their relationship, in that they're flirting and they're joking together and they go off and don't notice that an hour has passed because they've been sitting under a tree talking. But at the same time, you're seeing this big gulf that exists between them.
Yes.
So most of what we've been talking about so far has been about the trip to Sotherton. But of course, in this section, we've also got chapter 11. Back when we were talking about the introduction of Mary and Fanny and Edmund being so censorious about the way she spoke about her uncle, even though we thought that was such an innocuous thing to say. Well, suddenly in this chapter, we've got Mary being much more openly critical of Dr. Grant when she says that I see him to be an indolent, selfish bon vivant who must have his palate consulted in everything, who will not stir a finger for the convenience of anyone, and who, moreover, if the cook makes a blunder, is out of humour with his excellent wife. So this is far, far more overtly critical of Dr. Grant than anything she said of Admiral Crawford. And yet Edmund and Fanny actually agree. So what Edmund says is, I do not wonder at your disapprobation, upon my word. It is a great defect of temper, made worse by a very faulty habit of self-indulgence. When we were talking about it a couple of episodes ago, I'd forgotten the amount of criticism that happens of Dr. Grant in this chapter.
The difference is she's not being smart aleck about it.
But what I said when we were talking about that was that I felt Jane Austen was very strong on family loyalty. And this is family loyalty, and yet, family disloyalty, and Edmund is joining in. And even Fanny joins in, but with Fanny we get this hesitance. So she says whatever profession Dr. Grant had chosen, he would have taken not a good temper into it. So she's not disputing what Mary Crawford has said, but is kind of really restraining herself from going full-on criticism in the way that Edmund does. So I thought that was a really interesting passage.
Yeah.
And I'm not, because I was so strong before on how important it is to Jane Austen to maintain family unity, I'm a little bit unsure about how to take this one where it seems like this greater criticism isn't being censured so much. But I do wonder if we are meant to see the lack of censure as being the amount of influence Mary is having on Edmund, and maybe we're actually meant to pick up on that and be concerned.
No, well, I don't think so, but then partly I don't think I quite agreed as much with you on their disapproving, because it was criticising the Admiral. I tended to think what they just criticised was that society's smart way of talking.
Okay.
My feeling is that it's the difference in tone. Once she moves into this serious discussion of character and they just join in one of those discussions that obviously Jane Austen thinks intelligent people do. you've latched so totally onto this as really manners. Well, no, family loyalty.
Yeah.
But I think you're taking it far too seriously.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, the thing I wanted to mention that starts coming up to me in this point is the information we're not given about Fanny.
Yeah.
Some things we're told about Fanny, other things we don't know. We do not know what Fanny feels about Edmund and the future. Firstly, does she have fantasies of actually marrying him? I mean, she's only 17. She could be having, sort of schoolgirl fantasies. But does she think that's a possibility? Or does she think, as her kind of morality would be driving her to say, no, I love him, I would love to be his wife, but he deserves somebody worthy. So when Mary Crawford comes along, jealousy is not an issue as far as she's concerned. She doesn't have to have any scruples about not wanting Mary to be involved with Edmund. She knows she's wrong for him. I just feel, well, it's all this stuff that Jane Austen doesn't give us about Fanny. So we've got to invent that for ourselves.
Somewhere in the book, and I can't remember where, doesn't it say something about Fanny having this idea that she will keep house for William?
Yes.
Because while she's having that picture of her future, obviously that doesn't involve being married to Edmund.
Well, I think the point is that she's a 17-year-old girl, who has pictures of the future.
Yeah.
And so we don't know.
So did you have a favourite sentence, or do you want me to do mine first?
You do your favourite sentence.
I'm having problems again, as we notice with Sense and Sensibility. Sometimes you have something that you think is your favourite sentence and then find it's actually only half of a much longer sentence.
Yes.
My favourite sentence is really the second half of this sentence, which is, Edmund has offered to not go to Sotherton so he can stay with his mother and Fanny can go. Yeah. And then Mrs. Grant offers to stay with Lady Bertram. Even Edmund was very thankful for an arrangement which restored him to his share of the party. And Mrs. Norris thought it an excellent plan and had it at her tongue's end and was on the point of proposing it when Mrs. Grant spoke. I just think that's just such a lovely encapsulation of Mrs. Norris's way of going on.
Yes, and it just builds up this wonderful picture of Mrs. Norris, which is such a magnificent piece of characterisation. No, well, the one I got is one that I like it because it's emphasising the niceness and sweetness of Mary Crawford, in spite of her lack of principle. They've arrived at Sotherton, and it says, Miss Crawford was not slow to admire. She pretty well guessed Miss Bertram's feelings and made it a point of honour to promote her enjoyment to the utmost.
It's what we were talking about last time. Mary Crawford wants people to be happy.
But up to a point, she's not all that scrupulous about how true what she's encouraging to feel.
She has a much higher social conscience of making sure the party goes well than moral conscience of making sure everyone is always telling the truth. So this episode we're talking about two characters, Maria and Julia, because I think it works well to discuss them as a pair because there are some interesting parallels and differences between them.
Also, I think it's very rarely that Jane Austen talks about one without mentioning the other.
True.
And the effect on the other of what's happening.
They do start off very similar, in fact almost interchangeable in the first bit, but it's with the arrival of Henry Crawford that they really start to go in different directions. And
well, it's the first time they start to feel at odds with one another.
Yeah.
I just was highlighting this particular point. With no natural fault of temper or difference of opinion to prevent their being very good friends while their interests were the same, the sisters, under such a trial as this, that is, Henry Crawford preferring one to the other, had not affection or principle enough to make them merciful or just, to give them honour or compassion. Maria felt her triumph and pursued her purpose, careless of Julia, and Julia could never see Maria distinguished by Henry Crawford without trusting that it would create jealousy and bring a public disturbance at last. They've always been praised together. They've been doing the good things. Suddenly somebody comes between them and they turn round and start hating one another.
Yeah.
And Jane Austen and Fanny think the reason they turn round and start hating one another is lack of principle. They have never learnt that they must like one another no matter what and forgive one another things.
Yeah.
And this is where I come into this big long account of what I think is going on here. One of the things we're told right at the end is the problem with Julia and Maria is they had never been properly taught to govern their inclinations and tempers by the sense of duty which alone can suffice. They had been instructed theoretically in their religion, but never required to bring it into daily practice.
That's a summing up of it at the end. But we actually get fed that information throughout the book as well. And what we see, I think, is that on the surface, they are both very pretty behaved girls. Yeah. They do exactly the right thing. So I think it's kind of amusing that on two occasions, first when it comes to riding the barouche box, and second when it comes to playing the part of Agatha, they're both determined to get it for themselves, but also determined to not look like they want to get it for themselves.
And this is exactly what they've been taught.
Yes.
From the beginning, they have not been taught, and he seems to believe they should have been taught to like one another.
Yeah.
And they haven't.
So they've got all this behaviour on the surface, but underneath it's still driven by self-interest, I guess, which, to be honest, I think is not actually unreasonable. They know what they want, but they're still sort of putting on the good surface. But the bit that I think is really important is at Sotherton, when Julia has been stuck with Mrs. Norris and Mrs. Rushworth, and it says, "The politeness which she had been brought up to practice as a duty made it impossible for her to escape, while the want of that higher species of self-command, that just consideration of others, that knowledge of her own heart, that principle of right which had not formed any essential part of her education, made her miserable under it." Now, again, I've got to say, it is, I think, asking quite a lot of Julia to not just do the polite thing and stay with Mrs. Norris and Mrs. Rushworth, but also to enjoy it. She can be polite, she does the right thing. Really, at least to my perspective, you can't force yourself to enjoy doing something that is frankly boring you rigid. You can't make yourself enjoy it.
This is the sort of thing that I started thinking about. All right, they think she should have been taught to be pleased with herself, as Fanny is all the way through, for doing the right thing, which isn't the thing you want. So I was sort of reading forward into what happens in the Victorian period and how were children taught this sort of thing. So later on, in a later episode, when I'll be talking about evangelicalism, I'll be talking about how one of the main pressures it put on people was self-examination. Am I doing the right thing? And what by the Victorian period was happening, this was being done by mothers, and they did not just watch the children's behaviour and say, do this or do that, as Aunt Norris did. They kept on telling them why they should behave, what they should be feeling. And I found this example in a book by Juliana Horatio Ewing called Mary's Meadow. This book was quite late, published 1886, but I think it's just pulling together the sort of things that happened. And she said, "Mother is always trying to make us love our neighbours as ourselves. She does so despise us for greediness or grudging or snatching or not sharing what we have, or taking the best and leaving the rest, or helping ourselves first, or pushing forward, or praising number one, or being dogs in the manger, or anything selfish. And we cannot bear her to despise us. I remember once Mother had been trying to make us forgive each other's trespasses, and Arthur would say that you cannot make yourself feel kindly to them that trespass against you. And Mother said, if you make yourself do right, then at last you get to feel right. And what that is saying is you've got this mother who is watching their behaviour, and when she sees them doing things, she criticises them.
So that definitely ties in with what it says about Julia being miserable because she hasn't been given that higher level of learning.
As she says, loving your neighbour. But all these little bad things they can do are picked out, like being grudging, like snatching. So what she would have done would watch out for any sense of competition between Julia and Maria and try to say, no, that's not the way. She's your sister, you should do this. And giving them these principles. And this is just, my guess, but you think, well, what did Sir Thomas want? But it's almost there where it moves on to saying Lady Bertram was not interested in their education, but people could be taught, or Sir Thomas thought they should, as children.
And we were saying last time when we talked about Mary Crawford how she was let down by her education because there was this gap that should be filled by principle.
Yeah.
And I think we're being given a different picture of the same thing with Maria and Julia. They've got all this surface stuff, but they don't have the underlying principle, and that's what goes wrong for them. And I think that's another difference we do see all the way through, is that we are getting these bits that Julia feels pricks of conscience. So Julia is the one that stays with Mrs. Norris and Mrs. Rushworth, even though she's not happy about it. There's another bit, I think it might be when they're talking about going to Sotherton and Edmund offering to stay at home with Lady Bertram. Julia leaves the room under a consciousness that she should have offered herself. So she's aware of this and she's kind of trying to pretend she hasn't noticed so that she doesn't feel obligated to do anything. Also, of course, Julia is the one who speaks up and says that I'm sure Fanny spends less time on the sofa than anyone else. So admittedly, that's when she's in a particularly good mood because she's been spending time with Henry Crawford.
Yeah.
Because also at Sotherton, she says to Fanny that you managed to get out of it. But then, of course, at the end of the book, we actually get this summing up of the difference between them. That Julia escaped better than Maria was owing in some measure to a favourable difference of disposition and circumstance, but in a greater to her having been less the darling of that very aunt, less flattered and less spoiled. Her beauty and acquirements had held but a second place. She had always been used to think herself a little inferior to Maria. Her temper was naturally the easiest of the two. Her feelings, though quick, were more controllable, and education had not given her so very hurtful a degree of self-consequence. And then it goes on to explain that she had submitted best to the disappointment in Henry Crawford, and after the first bitterness of the conviction of being slighted was over, she had been tolerably soon in a fair way of not thinking of him again. And I think the particularly important bit is that when he does turn up again in town, she deliberately chooses that time to go somewhere else. She actively removes herself from the temptation, whereas Maria, because she has more of this hurtful degree of self-consequence, she is proud and has to prove to Henry Crawford that she doesn't care, and then that piques his vanity, and it's just this cycle of stuff.
Yes.
So I think basically, like with Mary Crawford, but from a different angle, again, just emphasises how much this book is looking at education and the importance of a right principle-based education.
Except, of course, it does not tell you how she thinks a principled education should be delivered. She says you should have it, and yet nothing.
I think maybe she assumes we know that, and she assumes that by presenting Mrs. Norris the way she does and Lady Bertram the way she does, that we'll work it out.
It's just one of these ones that when you read the Victorian stuff, you know how all this early training happens. There's nothing to suggest in Jane Austen that it is happening.
Looking at what happens to them at the end, Julia marrying Mr. Yates, again, that is in fact kind of prepared for at the start, because when Yates first appears, we know that he finds Julia attractive. And so when she, at the end, she knows it's all going to come crashing down and she has to get away from it, and she has been seeing more of Mr. Yates in town. It does kind of make sense that she'd marry him. And the book does tell us that Sir Thomas finds Mr. Yates not as bad as he'd thought at first.
Right at the beginning, we're actually told that Mr. Yates is a younger son, but that somehow he has his own money.
So I think basically we're meant to assume that Julia and Mr. Yates, it may not be the ideal marriage for love, but it's probably going to be pretty okay.
Well, it's probably better than Wickham and Lydia.
Well, certainly. But I do end up feeling quite sorry for Maria. After looking through it carefully, there's a lot of points at which Maria is actually rather hard done by. One of them is she has perversely suffered by the fact of being Mrs. Norris's favourite, but also she doesn't seem to have had any sort of London season. Yeah, one can assume, I think, that had Sir Thomas not gone to Antigua, he would have taken Maria, or probably Maria and Julia, to London at some point, and she would have had a London season. But as it is, the only people she's met are the people she's known pretty much all her life and Mr. Rushworth. So she hasn't really had much experience of the world before getting engaged to Mr. Rushworth. And then Henry Crawford turns up on the scene. Whereas if she'd had a London season, she would have met other Henry Crawford types. And so if she'd chosen to become engaged to Mr. Rushworth, it would have been in full knowledge of what the world has to offer. But also, honestly, I think she is really badly treated by Henry Crawford. Because you can say that Henry Crawford is flirting with both the girls, but the stuff he says to Maria, I think, goes beyond flirting. It's very suggestive. And I think Maria has some justification for believing that when her father comes home, Henry Crawford will declare himself and she will be able to break her engagement to Mr. Rushworth.
Well, I think that's absolutely true.
I think Henry has definitely led Maria on to believe that he feels more strongly for her. All his innuendos about, I don't like seeing Miss Bertram so close to the altar. I will never be so happy to be at Sotherton as I am now. He's very much saying he doesn't want her to get married.
Yes.
And that is moving, I think, way beyond just flirting with her.
Well, the point is, she has never met anyone who uses that form of flirting.
Yeah.
She's simply not accustomed to it.
Yeah. So I think Maria is justified in this misapprehension, and I completely blame Henry Crawford for that. Maybe she doesn't, as the narrator says, have as good a disposition as Julia, but she's been let down by her education, she's been let down by being Mrs. Norris's favourite, she's been very badly treated by Henry Crawford. And yes, she was the one who, when he came back into their lives, unlike Julia, who went away, she continued to see him. So she does have to own her own decisions, but at the same time, I guess she wasn't given this framework of principle, and I guess that's my final feeling. I don't exonerate her for the decision she made, but I do feel sorry for her because in so many ways she was let down by so many people, and that led her to making poor decisions. And actually, one other thing I was going to say about Maria, if you think back to Pride and Prejudice, where Mr. Bennet is talking to Elizabeth just after Darcy has been to see him, and he says to Elizabeth, you could not be happy or respectable if you did not love your husband. Because he thinks she's marrying Darcy just for the money. And of course, that is exactly what Maria does. She marries Mr. Rushworth for the money. She does not love him. She does not esteem him. She basically holds him in contempt. Yeah. And so she is not happy. And potentially, if it wasn't Henry Crawford, sooner or later, she would have been unfaithful to him with someone else anyway, maybe, because again, she hasn't been given this framework of principle, and she hasn't been exposed to enough society, which is why she chose to marry him in the first place. So, like I said, she's made bad decisions, but the book shows us what has led to those bad decisions, and I'd never really fully appreciated it, I don't think, until this most recent read-through.
Yes. In the historical section this time, I decided to talk about the whole idea of the improvement of estates and what Mr. Rushworth was hoping to do with Sotherton. We started talking something about what the ideals of landscaping at that time were when we were talking about Pride and Prejudice, and particularly when they were all walking around Pemberley, and each time they came to a window, they looked out onto the park or the landscape, and it was always a little bit different and a little bit more charming, and came to the conclusion that Jane Austen was absolutely committed to the current ideals of landscaping. She didn't even have any attempt to query them, and she goes into it in a bit more detail when we come up to what's happening at Sotherton. So to look at what the whole context of landscaping in that period was you have to start by realising that in the 17th century, in the 1600s, the ideas of landscaping were very, very artificial. They were always done in terms of geometric things. If you look at pictures, say, of the landscaping at Versailles, it's all in crisscrosses and little circles, and they had particularly for the flower gardens what they called parterres, which were again all in geometrical forms, often with little raised beds, little box hedges surrounding where the flowers were. And this sort of geometric thing was even there on small domestic gardens, going a bit further back. But if you talk about the Elizabethan knot gardens, they were the herb gardens, but little bush hedges around them, all in these geometric designs. And that was what the pattern was. And then in the 18th century, this starts to change. And the examples given, the influences that are mentioned in the pretty rudimentary stuff that I've read, is that it was partly the influence of Chinese gardening, which talked about winding ones. But the thing they mentioned that I found most interesting, they said it was also the painters of that period, people like Claude Lorraine and Poussin, who painted largely classical scenes, but they set them in these elaborate, what was meant to be what the Roman Campagna was. These landscapes with clumps of trees here and there, and the occasional cliff and the occasional water. Now, I went to a lecture some years ago on somebody who was talking about how Claude Lorraine designed these landscapes he had. And they said he made a big thing of going round to all these different country houses, and when he saw an attractive clump of trees that he thought was picturesque, he made a copy of that and he took it home with him. And then when he was doing the landscape backgrounds to his paintings, he rearranged them, and he put this clump of trees there and that clump of trees there.
Okay.
And this, in fact, seems to have been almost what then the landscape designers that came after him did. It was as though they, having got tired of all this geometric stuff and artificiality, they started looking at the parklands that had always been there and saying, look, these are nice to look at, but let's make them a bit better. And they were doing pretty much what Lorraine was doing with his landscapes, and putting clumps of trees here, and we'll put a clump of trees there. If we need water, we can perfectly well dam this little creek here and make a lovely big water view. And if we need to, we can put a bridge across it, which will give some definition to what we're looking at, so that each time you look out of the windows of the house, you get these lovely prospects of this scene and that scene. And the person who's best known for that was a man whose name was Lancelot Brown, but he was always known as Capability Brown. He was well established when Jane Austen was growing up. He died in 1783, so his big impact had happened by then. When people hired him, he came in and he dug up their gardens and he moved things around, and he did the lot. He was followed, though, in the next generation by Humphrey Repton, and of course he is mentioned in Mansfield Park. But if it was in 1813, he would have been in a wheelchair by then because he was getting on. Anyway, what Repton did, he didn't so much turn up and hire all these men and get them digging and so on. What he did was he created what he called red books. And on his red books, he'd have a nice watercolour picture of what the prospect was like from outside. And then he'd paint another one with what he thought should be done to make it improved. I don't think he did actually come in and organise the workmen, but you had to pay him for how long it took him to go out there and draw up his red book and give it to you. And that's obviously what Mr. Rushworth's friend Smith had done at his place and what he wants to get done. And one of the points with Repton was again with these extra bits, whereas Capability Brown had been wanting to make it look mostly as though it was nature. Repton started moving back in things like terraces outside a house with balustrades, and
Which Sotherton has a terrace.
when that came in, you can't be sure, but anyway, Repton definitely, according to the bits I've been reading, started putting terraces in. And also there was this thing, and it may have been started with Capability Brown, of building up a folly or a hermitage or a ruin or a bit of ruined castle, the sort of thing that would make a contrast. And I can remember seeing out of somebody's window looking at countryside, and it was terribly improved because it had, I think it was part of an electricity thing there, but just the fact of it having something done in brickwork just did make it more pleasant to look at.
So what, instead of just nothing but field,
But park and clumps of trees and that sort of thing, but to sort of have something in brickwork made a fascinating contrast. And even though this brickwork was, I think, an electricity station or something like that, it was still nice to see it. She disapproves so much of all this geometric stuff. They talk about a considerable flight of steps landed them in the wilderness, which was a planted wood of about 2 acres, and though chiefly of larch and laurel and beech cut down, and though laid out with too much regularity, was darkness and shade. So this being laid out with too much regularity, she's just totally accepted the Capability Brown principles of it looking natural.
Yeah. There's also, of course, the ha-ha. So did you want to talk about exactly what a ha-ha is?
Well, the ha-ha was just a technique for making sure that even if you had pasture land coming in, you could have it incorporated into these vistas that you had. But what you didn't want was hedges or fences or anything of that sort. So they had deep ditches dug between the various pieces of pasture to separate them, so you could have one sort of animal in one, or you could have crops in one. And you still had this, your eye went over this thing without change.
Yesterday I was looking at lots of pictures on the internet of ha-has. I also dug up the photo I took a couple of years ago when we went to Chawton, because the estate at Chawton had a ha-ha.
Did it? Oh, right.
The one at Chawton, it was a ditch, and then there was a fence at the bottom of the ditch.
Yes.
So the fence is completely invisible. But the ones I've seen on the internet, and particularly in the description on Wikipedia, it's almost like the people side of it is a steep drop with a retaining wall, but then the animal side of it, it's more of a gentle slope so that the animals won't fall into a ditch, but they get to this retaining wall and they can't get up it. But whereas today we'd use a retaining wall as part of a terrace, in this it was just, it went along, retaining wall, and then it sloped up again. So if you're standing back, you don't see the retaining wall or the drop, you just see the landscape continuing.
Well, I think that does sound a very appropriate way of doing it.
I think there are probably several types of ha-ha, and without more information from Jane Austen, we don't know whether it's one with a little retaining wall or whether it's one that's just a ditch. I might put some of these photos and diagrams I found in the show notes.
Yes, but anyway, people on the other hand had to get across ha-has.
Yeah.
So usually there would be a way across. Sometimes it was just a solid way, nobody dug the ditch the whole way around.
Yeah.
Sometimes it could be a little bridge, but obviously you had to be able to stop the animals going through.
Yeah.
And so usually they had a gate at the end. And now I think everybody has their own idea of what the ha-ha in Mansfield Park was like. I have got a permanent picture which I developed at a period when I'd been doing quite a bit of living in England and going from country houses, and that was of an iron gate at the end of the bridge or firm piece of land, with on either side of it a large semicircular piece of ironwork coming out, which had radiating spikes coming up from it. And that seemed to me to make absolute sense, because she says,
Fanny says, you will certainly hurt yourself against those spikes. You will tear your gown. You will be in danger of slipping into the ha-ha.
And then again, the spikes I'm visualising
Yeah.
are on one edge of the ha-ha. And so to get round it, you'd have to sort of hold on to it and come round the other side. And, you could well be in danger of falling in. On the other hand, anyone who's
of an average level of athleticism.
Yes, ought to be able to do that and come round the other side. And I'm sure there are all sorts of other ways of having ha-has. But that's the ha-ha I'm convinced they had in Mansfield Park.
When I was looking on the internet yesterday, I couldn't find anything like that. I was also thinking, if your ha-ha is like between two park areas, it would look kind of weird to have just this gate in the middle of nowhere. But then I remembered, of course, this ha-ha is separating the park from the wilderness. So it is a gate out of the wilderness. And that then made me think, well, why do you need a ha-ha? Why couldn't you just have had a wall around the wilderness? But of course, from within the wilderness, you still want to be able to see the parkland. From the house, you might want to see past the wilderness.
Well, I think if you're looking across parkland, you don't want to see a wall or a fence and then a little wood.
Yeah.
You want to see a little wood growing out of the landscape.
And just one gate wouldn't be a problem. Now, it is worth noting, just for a different point of view, again going back to the Cambridge edition.
Yes.
The notes in that, they're basically describing that there's the gate, but there's a hedge on either side of the gate. And so when Maria is getting through, the boundary in this place is not iron railings or a wooden fence which would come up to the iron gate, but a hedge of hawthorn or privet, perhaps, leaving gaps, and that is why Fanny fears she will tear her gown.
But Fanny says she's going to tear her gown on iron spikes.
Yes, but no, she doesn't say iron spikes, she just says spikes. But also, this description doesn't allow for Fanny saying you will fall into the ha-ha. This description seems to be implying that it's a ha-ha, and then on the ha-ha is a hedge. And what's the point of having a ha-ha if you've also got a hedge next to it?
Yes.
So that doesn't, to me, make a lot of sense.
Anyways, that's what we plan to do, isn't it?
Yeah, we probably spend a lot more of it talking about the ha-ha than we necessarily really needed to, but I think it's an interesting point. Just before I start talking about the pop culture versions of the chapters we've talked about this week, I want to correct something I said last time, where I got the 1999 and the 2007 versions muddled up. I talked about the introduction of Henry and Mary starting with a slow pan from their feet up to their head, really trying to tell you how you should take these characters. I said that was in the 2007 version. It was actually in the 1999 film version that they did that. So that's just a correction.
All right.
I'm going to have a bit less to say this time because some of the adaptations just don't include the Sotherton scenes for whatever reason. But the first adaptation, the BBC 1983 version with Sylvester Latouzel and Nicholas Farrell, that included the Sotherton scenes, and as with much of this adaptation, it pretty much follows point for point with the book. It's compressed things a little bit because Edmund specifically asks Mrs. Grant to stay with Lady Bertram so Fanny can go.
All right.
The barouche has 4 horses, and they're travelling in it with the hood down, so it's quite easy for Julia to just speak over her shoulder to Mary Crawford and Fanny, who of course are sitting with their backs to the horses. We get the tour of the house from the book. We have the chapel from the book. As I said, it's all point for point from the book, and so much of the dialogue is directly from the book as well. The walk in the wilderness, the really interesting thing is they don't have a ha-ha. Instead, the gate is in a wall. And I printed out some pictures here, and I'll put a screen grab in the show notes. But what you can see in these not terribly good pictures is that there's this big wall with a gate in it.
Yes.
But beside the gate, between the edge of the gate and the wall, there's just a lower bit with some spikes. And that's the bit that Maria and then Julia squeeze through.
Oh, yes. Well, you've got a picture of one of them squeezing
Yes,
through.
that's Julia squeezing through. So they can retain the line from the book about you will hurt yourself on the spikes. But I'm guessing they just couldn't find a ha-ha with a gate and a wilderness that matched the description in the book, and they didn't want to build one in a studio. You don't need the ha-ha after all. I just would have liked to see their vision of how it fitted with.
Well, I think quite honestly, a lot of readers of Mansfield Park would have been very grateful if they'd shown a ha-ha.
So moving on, the other 2 adaptations of Mansfield Park, The 1999 version with Frances O'Connor and Johnny Lee Miller, and also the 2007 TV movie with Billie Piper and Blake Ritson, neither of those have the trip to Sotherton at all. They just cut it completely. Almost certainly part of this is just time constraints. They were both movie-length versions. They had to cut something. Possibly also it was budgetary. They didn't want to spend the money to go and find another estate to do the filming in. But it's kind of a pity. It does really highlight one of the problems of trying to compress a Jane Austen novel, and particularly one as rich as Mansfield Park, trying to compress that into a 2-hour period, because that Sotherton scene has so much important character stuff in it that they have to either leave out completely or try and shoehorn into other moments.
And which do they do?
Both. They leave a lot of it out. They try and squeeze some bits in elsewhere. But mostly they just leave it out.
Yeah.
It's disappointing but understandable under the circumstances. I get that they had to make these decisions. On the other hand, the web series from Mansfield with Love, the modernised version, that of course has even more time than the BBC 1983 version, because it's short episodes of 5 to 10 minutes twice a week over a period of a year. So in that one, they do have the Sotherton equivalent. So you remember I said the concept for this is that Mansfield Park is a hotel, and that Rory Rushworth, his family, owns a bigger hotel called the Sotherton, which is in Brighton.
Yes.
So they all go to Brighton to see the Sotherton because Henry wants to make suggestions about improving it, and Rhea wants to go shopping, and Mary wants to show Fanny the shops. So they all go in the train except for Julia and Henry, because Henry doesn't do the train, so he's driving down in his new car, and Julia gets to go with him.
Well, it's only a 2-seater car, isn't it?
Yeah, and Rhea's not very happy about that. So that's the concept of how they deal with it. Now, when they first get to Brighton, there's a Brighton montage. Them doing dodgem cars on the pier and looking at the sea and all that sort of thing. The equivalent of the scene where Mary is disparaging of the church and then discovers Edmund is planning to take orders. Instead, Mary talks at length about how she hated school and how terrible the teachers were, and only then learns that Ed is studying to become a teacher.
Yes.
And she feels that that is such a waste because it's not a well-paid job, and Fanny and Edmund defend it on the basis that it's meaningful work and something he enjoys.
Yes.
So that's how they modernise that clash. And of course you could have modernised it and still had him going into the church, but they...
Or the other thing you could have modernised him was him being a social worker.
Which of course, thinking back to Sense and Sensibility, that is what Edward Ferrars in that ends up doing. He moves into a social work type field.
Yes.
But yeah, in this one, he's studying to be a teacher. So they get that scene in. And I thought that worked pretty well. What I was slightly less convinced by was the equivalent of going through the gate. Fanny is sitting by the pier. She says that Ed and Mary have gone off to get fish and chips, but I've been waiting here a long time. And then the trio of Henry, Mariah and Rory Rushworth turn up. Henry says, why don't we go for a swim? And Mariah sends Rory back to get her swimmers and a pair of shorts for himself. And then while Rory is gone, Henry convinces Mariah to just skinny dip. They go in, and then Julia comes along and sees it, but Julia does not go in with them. She just goes off. And then Rory gets back with Mariah's stuff, and it is really heartbreaking. They get the lines in like, I wouldn't have had to follow them in if they'd waited for me, all that sort of thing. But because he has got no brains, but he's such a nice person, it's just so sad. Fanny is trying to say, how Mariah likes to be adventurous, and he said, yes, I know, it's one of the things I love about her, but I'd like it better if she was being adventurous with me.
Yeah.
It really gets a lot more pathos into the Rushworth character than I think the book does, deliberately.
The book doesn't really get much pathos in.
I think that line about, I wouldn't have had to follow them if they'd waited for me, that's not an exact quote, but there is some pathos there, but overall it is kind of hard to really empathise with Mr. Rushworth because he is not all that nice.
Well, and also, he is so boring.
Yeah. So is this one boring, but somehow he's boring nice, and you feel sorry for him.
Yes.
So that's how From Mansfield with Love deals with it. I said last time when I was talking about the D.E. Stevenson book, Celia's House, it's not really a modernisation of the book, just some bits are there, and The Visit to Sotherton is not one of those some bits. So really that's all I've got to say about the pop culture versions.
Yes.
You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
And me, Ellen. In our next episode, we'll be looking at chapters 12 to 16 of Mansfield Park.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and our website readingjaneausten.com.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.